May 3, 1951. Washington, D.C. The United States Capitol. Rain lashes against the marble steps like a drumbeat of distant artillery. Inside, the halls are crowded with correspondents, military aides, and grim-faced senators moving with purpose. The air smells of wet wool coats and fresh ink, the kind hurriedly scribbled onto notepads moments before a nation-shaking testimony begins. General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the man soldiers once called the GI's general, moves down a narrow corridor toward the Senate Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committee's joint hearing room. His footsteps echo, steady but heavy, as though each pace carries the weight of the entire Korean peninsula. He adjusts the thin stack of classified notes hidden within his briefing folder. They are not for public consumption. Some aren't meant to be spoken aloud at all. But today, the stakes demand more than caution. They demand clarity. Because today, Bradley must answer a question that threatens to tear the nation's military leadership in two. Should the United States follow General Douglas MacArthur's call to expand the Korean War into mainland China, or should it refuse? The cameras outside flash. The murmurs swell. The doors swing open. But before Bradley can speak his fateful words, before he tells the Senate that MacArthur's strategy would lead to the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy, the story that brought America to this moment takes us back to a frozen battlefield halfway across the world. The frozen road to crisis, Korea, winter 1950. November 27, 1950. Chosin Reservoir, North Korea. The ridgeline is a serrated black silhouette against a moonlit sky. The temperature sinks to 40 degrees below zero. Rifle bolts freeze. Men break toes without knowing it. Frostbite stalks the trenches faster than the enemy. Marines of the 1st Marine Division stand guard behind makeshift rock walls, their breath curling like smoke from a locomotive. The wind slices through their parkas. In the distance, echoing between the mountains, comes the eerie sound they all dread. Chinese bugles. Hundreds of them. Then thousands. You can almost feel the tremor in the earth, boots slamming the frozen ground, cascading down the ridges in waves. The People's Volunteer Army, 120,000 strong, materializes from the darkness like ghosts. They attack with grenades, burp guns, rifle fire, and sheer momentum. Captain Robert Taplet, commanding the Marines at Udemy, shouts orders over the chaos. Hold the line. Hold it. Muzzle flashes strobe the night. Mortars thump from the hills. Chinese soldiers surge forward, screaming battle cries that ricochet through the valley. It is here, in this brutal cauldron of ice and steel, that the seeds of the Bradley-MacArthur confrontation are planted. MacArthur will later insist that China's intervention proves that Washington must change the strategy, strike Manchuria, bomb Chinese bases, unleash nationalist Chinese forces, and expand the war. He will claim that without escalation, the US will be crushed by endless waves of Chinese troops. But Bradley, along with the Joint Chiefs, will come to an entirely different conclusion. That conclusion is being written right now, in blood, on the mountains around the Chosin Reservoir. A collision of visions begins. While Marines fight for survival in North Korea, thousands of miles away in Tokyo, General Douglas MacArthur watches the situation unfold from his headquarters in the Daiichi building. Maps line the walls. Staff officers shuffle intelligence estimates. Radios hum with emergency reports. MacArthur stands rigid, pipe in hand, convinced he can still win this war his way. To him, China's entry is not a warning, it is an opportunity. If China has decided to fight, he believes the United States must respond with the full power of its arsenal. He orders bold counteroffensives. He pressures Washington to remove restrictions on bombing Chinese supply lines. And each message he sends back to the Pentagon grows sharper, more insistent, more impatient. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Omar Bradley pores over the same battlefield reports. But he sees something entirely different. Not an opportunity, but a catastrophe narrowly averted by the courage and discipline of UN forces. Bradley knows what the secret intelligence says, information MacArthur does not accept or refuses to believe. That China can pour millions more men into Korea. That Soviet jet squadrons stand ready in Manchuria. That escalation could ignite a larger war across the entire Asian continent. Bradley's growing certainty crystallizes as the temperatures in Korea continue to fall and the number of casualties climbs. The Chinese intervention is not a tactical hiccup. It is a geopolitical earthquake. And the fracture line runs straight between Washington and Tokyo. Into the mountains, the fight to escape Chosin. The Chinese attacks intensify as November turns to December. Entire ridges erupt in fire. Marines at Chosin fight from frozen foxholes, their gloves stiff, their water canteens solid blocks of ice. Men use flamethrowers not just on enemy positions but on their own rifles to thaw the metal. When dawn breaks after the first night of assault, bodies lie strewn across the snow, American, Chinese, Korean, frozen in the positions they died in. The cold has preserved everything in horrifying detail. The 7th Marines push south toward Hagaruari, fighting through ambushes every mile. The narrow mountain road becomes a kill zone. Convoys are raked by machine gun fire. Engineers blow open snowdrifts under fire to clear paths. Pilots flying low risk their lives to drop supplies onto postage stamp landing zones. On one ridge, Lieutenant John Yancey of the 5th Marines holds his position despite being hit repeatedly, shrapnel to the face, bayonet wounds to the chest, grenade fragments in his legs. Yet he refuses evacuation. He continues fighting until his men are safe. Stories like his travel quickly up the chain of command. They reach Tokyo, Washington, and eventually the private intelligence dossiers read by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Bradley sees what MacArthur refuses to acknowledge: China is not lightly testing US resolve. China is fighting a full-scale war. And unless the United States expands the conflict into Chinese territory, which President Truman has already forbidden, the American objective must shift from total victory to limited containment. Intelligence Washington could not ignore. In a dimly lit Pentagon briefing room, analysts from the Office of Naval Intelligence and the CIA lay out intercepted communications that leave no doubt. Chinese armies are not improvising, they are coordinating across provinces. Supply lines run deep into Manchuria, protected by Soviet air cover. If the US escalates, Moscow could invoke its treaty obligations. In early 1951, another classified report lands on Bradley's desk. It estimates that a full-scale war with China could draw in the Soviet Union and require up to 38 US divisions in massive naval blockades across the Western Pacific, a potential use of atomic weapons to halt Chinese manpower. Bradley leans back in his chair, quiet, absorbing the implications. He knows the country does not have 38 deployable divisions. He knows NATO would be left defenseless in Europe. He knows a wider war risks global nuclear escalation. And he knows MacArthur still disagrees. Tokyo versus Washington, lines harden. MacArthur continues pushing for escalation. He demands authority to bomb Manchurian bases. He urges opening a second front with nationalist Chinese forces. He delivers public statements that contradict administration policy, statements President Harry Truman never approved. Truman grows increasingly frustrated. The Joint Chiefs grow uneasy. The press senses a feud. American families with sons in Korea begin to ask painful questions. What is the goal? What is victory? And who is truly in charge, military commanders or elected leaders? The temperature in Washington rises even as Korea freezes. All paths lead toward a political and constitutional crisis. And as Bradley walks toward his Senate testimony room on May 3, 1951, he knows that whatever he says today will shape the fate of US military strategy, perhaps for generations. But he also knows that the truth is unavoidable. Chosin proved the scale of China's commitment. Intelligence proved the scale of the risk. And MacArthur's proposals, however bold, would ignite a war America could not win without sacrificing its alliances, its principles, and possibly millions of lives. Bradley grips the folder containing the classified briefings. He takes his seat at the long table surrounded by senators. Cameras snap. Pens hover. Silence falls. He clears his throat. What he is about to say will echo across the world. May 3, 1951. Washington, D.C. The hearing room is suffocatingly warm despite the rain still hammering the windows. Reporters crowd the back wall, their wrists poised above notepads. Flashbulbs crackle like distant artillery bursts. Bradley sits beneath the hanging microphones, their cables dangling like black vines over his head. Senators lean forward in their chairs, many with faces etched in anticipation, some in frustration, a few in outright hostility. Everyone in this room knows the stakes. The nation is deciding whether to follow the path outlined by Douglas MacArthur, the most decorated, most celebrated, most publicly adored general in America, or to reject it. A clerk signals that the cameras are rolling. Senator Richard Russell clears his throat. General Bradley, he begins, you may proceed with your statement. Bradley lifts his notes but doesn't look at them. His voice is calm, steady, the cadence of a man who has spent a lifetime giving orders under fire. Mr. Chairman, he begins, and members of this committee, it is my firm belief that expanding the war into mainland China would be, in my judgment. He pauses. The room holds its breath. The wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. A shockwave ripples through the crowd. Pens scratch furiously. Photographers lunge forward. Some senators exchange glances, some satisfied, some stunned. Bradley presses on. A nation listens as Bradley unveils what only the Joint Chiefs knew. He explains, carefully, deliberately, that the Joint Chiefs of Staff never agreed with MacArthur's push to bomb Manchuria, blockade China, or release nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan. Such operations, he says, would trigger Chinese retaliation across Asia and risk dragging the Soviet Union into open conflict. In Europe, our NATO forces are thin. Dangerously thin, Bradley says. If we shift our forces to Asia, the Soviets will exploit the vacuum. Someone coughs. A pencil snaps. The senators lean closer. The real enemy is not China, Bradley continues. It is Soviet expansionism. China is acting as a Soviet surrogate. Yes, but attacking China directly distracts from the central strategic threat. He does not mention that he is citing classified intelligence estimates that won't be declassified for another 20 years. But he knows his words must reveal just enough to make Congress understand the magnitude of the danger. He speaks of Soviet MiGs flying over Manchuria. Chinese infantry divisions mobilizing beyond anything MacArthur ever anticipated. The fragile balance in Europe, where the Red Army sits just across the Iron Curtain with overwhelming numbers. General MacArthur, Bradley concludes, is proposing a strategy that shifts our focus away from the principal threat. To fight China fully would be to fight the wrong enemy. The room is silent. Even the rain outside seems to pause. The senators probe, and Bradley holds the line. Senator Burke Hickenlooper, known for his bluntness, leans forward. General, are you telling us that General MacArthur, America's most experienced commander in Asia, is wrong? Bradley doesn't flinch. His plan, Bradley replies, would risk global war. Senator Millard Tydings interjects. A world war, with Russia. That is the likely outcome, Bradley says. No hesitation. And atomic weapons? Asks Senator Wayne Morse. Would this escalation require their use? Bradley nods slightly. Only if we intend to prevent catastrophic battlefield losses. The room stiffens. Nuclear war, spoken in public, sends ripples of unease through every man present. Then Senator Lyndon Johnson, still years away from the presidency, leans in with the sharpest question yet. General Bradley, are you saying General MacArthur's strategy violates the principle of civilian control? Bradley takes a breath. He knows this is the heart of the matter. In effect, he says, General MacArthur has sought to publicly pressure the government to adopt military actions it has not authorized. That is incompatible with the chain of command. The senators murmur. Bradley has just articulated what Truman could not say outright. The problem is not just strategy, but insubordination. Across the Pacific, MacArthur prepares his counterattack. While Bradley's words sweep across headlines in Washington, Douglas MacArthur is 7,000 miles away, preparing for his own testimony. He has just been relieved of command. His flight from Tokyo to San Francisco was met by massive crowds, cheering as though welcoming a conquering hero. MacArthur thrives in moments like this. Inside his suite at the Waldorf Astoria in New York, he stands in front of a towering window overlooking the city. His staff lays out briefing books, maps, and transcripts of Bradley's testimony. MacArthur does not sit. He reads while pacing, pipe clenched in his teeth. Wrong war, he mutters under his breath. Wrong enemy. His face tightens. He believes Bradley has surrendered the initiative, that Washington is capitulating out of fear. MacArthur sees history differently. He believes that China struck because America hesitated, not because China had strategic depth Washington underestimated. He insists that victory is still possible, if only Washington will give him the authority to carry it out. Airstrikes. Naval blockades. Deployment of nationalist Chinese divisions from Taiwan. He believes the Senate hearings are his chance to reclaim the narrative. But the Joint Chiefs have already begun dismantling the foundation of his argument. 7 weeks of tension, the hearings become a national spectacle. The Bradley-MacArthur confrontation becomes daily front-page news. Crowds gather at radio shops to listen. Movie theaters broadcast updated summaries before film reels. Civilians write letters by the millions, choosing sides. Some see Bradley as the steady statesman preventing World War III. Others see MacArthur as a betrayed hero silenced for telling the truth. Inside the Senate chamber, the hearings stretch on. Generals Ridgway, Collins, and Vandenberg join Bradley in testifying that escalation against China is unsound. Each describes the vast imbalance of manpower, the logistical vulnerability of U.S. forces, and the threat posed by the Soviet Union. They speak of narrow mountain roads, frozen rivers, and supply lines stretched so thin that entire divisions nearly ran out of ammunition during the Chosin breakout. At one point, General J. Lawton Collins, Army Chief of Staff, closes his eyes as he recalls the casualty numbers. If we escalate, he says, we risk fighting the Soviet Union at a time and place of their choosing. These are not public relations statements. They are warnings. Warnings shaped by the cold, brutal facts of Korea. Bradley's defining moment, a doctrine is born. On the 11th day of testimony, Senator Alexander Wiley returns to Bradley with a question that cuts to the core of the entire conflict. General Bradley, what then is our objective in Korea, if not total victory? Bradley answers without hesitation. Our objective, Senator, is to prevent the spread of communism without triggering a wider war. This is a limited war, fought for limited goals. Limited war. A phrase that will define the next 40 years of American foreign policy. Bradley doesn't yet know how influential these words will become. But the senators understand. The press understands. The public, slowly, begins to understand. For the first time in American history, a senior military leader is publicly articulating that not every war must be fought to unconditional surrender. The doctrine is born right there, in that wood-paneled chamber. As the hearing room empties, the pivot point is clear. When Bradley finally leaves the stand, escorted by aides, the tension in the hearing room seems to lift. People exhale. Reporters rush toward telephones. Senators retreat into private discussions. But as he exits through the side door, Bradley knows the real impact of his testimony will play out far beyond these walls. In NATO headquarters, where commanders fear the Red Army. In the White House, where Truman fights for constitutional authority. In Busan and Seoul, where U.S. soldiers brace for the next Korean offensive. And in the Kremlin, where Joseph Stalin watches closely, calculating America's next move. Bradley has done more than refute a strategy. He has defended the cornerstone of American democracy, civilian control of the military. But MacArthur is coming to Washington next. And he will not go quietly. The stage is set for the most dramatic confrontation yet. May 5, 1951. Washington National Airport. The runway glistens from a night of steady rain. A large Constellation transport aircraft taxis slowly toward the terminal, its engines humming like distant thunder. Along the perimeter fences, thousands of spectators press forward, waving flags, hoisting signs, lifting children onto their shoulders. Newsreel cameras clatter. Microphones are thrust over the crowd. General Douglas MacArthur steps onto the tarmac. He is immaculate, khaki shirt, open collar, crushed cap angled just so, aviator sunglasses masking any hint of fatigue. He walks with the deliberate, regal stride of a man entering not a controversy, but a coronation. Flashbulbs erupt. Someone shouts, "Welcome home, General." Another voice booms, "We believe in you, sir." MacArthur pauses only briefly, acknowledging the applause with a slight nod, as if absorbing the adoration like a returning emperor. He begins down a carpeted walkway flanked by military police and Senate staff. His wife, Jean, follows behind him, clutching her purse tightly. MacArthur's jaw is set. His mission is clear. He is here to reclaim the narrative. After nearly 3 weeks of Joint Chiefs' testimony undermining his entire war plan, this is his moment to match the fire of his dismissal speech, his "Old Soldiers Never Die" farewell broadcast to the nation. Now the eyes of Congress, and the world, are upon him again. Inside the Senate chamber, a different theater of war. May 7, 1951. The United States Capitol. The hearing room is even more crowded than when Bradley testified. Every chair is filled. Reporters stand 2 deep along the rear wall. Senators shuffle stacks of paper with trembling anticipation. Many, especially those who oppose Truman's firing of MacArthur, look eager, almost hungry, to hear his side of the story. The general enters slowly, head high, his uniform immaculate. He removes his cap, places it neatly on the table before him, and adjusts the microphone. He does not need an introduction. Not here. Not anywhere. Senator Richard Russell, presiding again, clears his throat. "General MacArthur, you may begin." MacArthur leans forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Mr. Chairman, and distinguished members." His voice flows smooth and resonant, carrying the cadence of a trained orator. He speaks not as a subordinate answering to his government, but as a man addressing history. MacArthur's opening salvo, a vision of total victory. He begins by describing the battlefield as he saw it, UN forces pushing north, near triumph, only to be suddenly overwhelmed by Chinese armies descending from the mountains. Then his tone sharpens. "We lost the initiative," he declares, "because we were not permitted to destroy the enemy's sanctuary in Manchuria. We were not permitted to strike the very source of Chinese power." He squares his shoulders, scanning the senators like a commander surveying a battlefield. "To win in Korea," he says, "we must wage war on the enemy who is actually fighting us, not the imaginary enemy in Moscow, but the real enemy across the Yalu." Pens fly across paper. Reporters exchange looks. This is a direct rebuttal to Bradley's formulation, "wrong enemy." MacArthur is deliberately countering every pillar of the Joint Chiefs argument. Furthermore, he continues, "The forces under my command were denied the necessary freedom of action to strike decisive blows. An army cannot fight with one hand tied behind its back." This line ignites murmurs across the chamber. MacArthur is not merely contesting strategy. He is accusing civilian leadership of sabotaging victory. Senators press the general, and he fires back. Senator Styles Bridges, a blunt MacArthur supporter, opens questioning. "General, is it your opinion that we could have won the war had the restrictions on your command been lifted?" MacArthur responds immediately. "Senator, victory was entirely feasible. It was deliberately prevented." The words hang in the air like a thunderclap. Reporters exchange stunned glances. Bradley and the Joint Chiefs had said escalation risked Soviet intervention. MacArthur now dismisses that possibility with a wave of his hand. The Chinese would have collapsed under sustained assault upon their supply lines. The Soviets would not have intervened, they understood the consequences. It is a bold claim. A dangerous one. And one based not on classified intelligence, but on MacArthur's personal conviction. Senator Wayne Morse leans forward. "General, did you have access to intelligence estimates indicating that Soviet forces were prepared to defend Manchuria if attacked?" MacArthur stiffens. "I had access to the necessary intelligence," he says curtly. Bradley, watching from a side room, closes his eyes. He knows this is evasive. He knows what the intelligence actually said: warnings, red flags, worst-case planning scenarios laid out in black and white. But MacArthur is not here to concede errors. He is here to argue destiny. MacArthur's grand plan, a second front across Asia. MacArthur raises a stack of documents and taps them lightly on the table. "My plan, in essence, was simple," he says. "We should have opened a second front." He outlines it with confident precision. a naval blockade of the Chinese coast, a bombing campaign on Manchurian airfields, and supply hubs, deployment of 300,000 nationalist Chinese troops from Taiwan, a renewed UN offensive sweeping north. He describes this as though discussing maneuvers on a parade field, not the onset of a campaign that could draw in the world's largest land army and the second largest nuclear power. As he speaks, several senators exchange quiet, uneasy glances. The difference between MacArthur and Bradley becomes stark. Bradley saw Korea within the global chessboard. MacArthur saw Korea as the chessboard itself. The question that changes the room. Then Senator Estes Kefauver leans in, voice measured, not confrontational. "General," he asks, "what if your plan had resulted in a Soviet attack on Western Europe?" A hush falls. For a moment, MacArthur's mask shifts. His jaw tightens. "I do not believe the Soviets would have risked war," he replies. "But if they had?" Kefauver presses. MacArthur hesitates. Then he answers, "In that case, Senator, we would have responded as necessary." The meaning is unmistakable. He is acknowledging the possibility of global war, and dismissing it as an acceptable risk. Across the room, a stenographer pauses for half a beat before typing the words. The clash the nation has waited for, MacArthur versus the Joint Chiefs. Senator Tidings raises a copy of Bradley's testimony. General MacArthur, Chairman Bradley stated that expanding the war into China would be the wrong war, wrong place, wrong time, wrong enemy. Do you disagree with all 4 points? MacArthur lifts his chin. I disagree with every one of them. His voice rises, the tempo accelerating, his frustration breaking through his polished decorum. This war, gentlemen, is not a limited conflict. It is part of the worldwide struggle against communism. Any strategy that refuses to strike the enemy's base is a strategy of appeasement. A ripple of shock spreads across the dais. MacArthur has just accused America's highest-ranking military officers of appeasement, during a public hearing broadcast nationwide. He continues, unstoppable. We lost the chance for total victory because we became fearful of Chinese and Soviet reaction. No great nation can win wars by being afraid of its enemies. Reporters scramble. Pencils tear paper. These quotes will hit front pages before the day ends. MacArthur's supporters in the gallery nod fiercely. His critics look stricken. This is no longer a hearing. It is ideological combat. The Judiciary Committee's private session, a rare glimpse behind closed doors. After hours of public testimony, the senators unanimously vote to hold a private classified session. The press is removed. Security tightens. Heavy wooden doors close with a resonant thud. MacArthur sits alone at the witness table, his aides dismissed. He has never been comfortable with classified briefings he cannot spin or shape. Here, behind closed doors, the senators question him about intelligence the public will not learn for decades. General MacArthur, Russell begins, our intelligence indicates China can deploy an additional 1.5 million troops. Were you aware of that assessment? MacArthur frowns. I did not agree with that estimate. Were you aware of it? Russell insists. MacArthur pauses. Yes. Another senator asks whether he received reports that Soviet jet squadrons were stationed in Manchuria. I received reports, MacArthur admits, but I did not consider them credible. Senator Tidings opens a folder and reads numbers aloud, numbers that would not be declassified until the 1970s. Troop capacities. Air division strengths. Supply reserve estimates. Worst-case projections of Soviet intervention. As the room absorbs the figures, the mood shifts noticeably. MacArthur's grand strategy suddenly feels less like visionary leadership, and more like dangerous optimism. When the doors reopen, MacArthur emerges looking composed, yet colder, more brittle. He knows the senators now realize the truth. His plan rested on assumptions. Bradley's plan rested on intelligence. A nation divides, and Congress begins choosing sides. Over the next several days, MacArthur returns to deliver more testimony. He is eloquent, forceful, at times dazzling. But gradually, the momentum shifts. Editorials begin to question the risks he was willing to take. Radio commentators dissect the inconsistencies in his statements. Even some senators who admired him now fear his willingness to gamble with global stability. Behind closed doors, staffers whisper the same observation. Bradley sounds like a strategist. MacArthur sounds like a crusader. And geopolitical crusades are expensive, usually in lives. By the end of the second week, senators privately admit what the hearings have revealed. MacArthur's dismissal was justified. His strategy would have widened the war. Civilian control must remain absolute. But the confrontation is not over. A deeper question remains. If the United States refuses total war in Asia, how does it win in Korea at all? That answer will reshape the remainder of the Cold War. April 14, 1951. Seoul, Korea. A cold dawn settles over the ruined city. Smoke rises in thin, ghostly ribbons above shattered rooftops and gutted storefronts. The smell of wet ash clings to every street. Soldiers from the 8th Army move cautiously through the rubble, their boots crunching over broken glass and frozen mud. A jeep pulls to a stop near what used to be the National Assembly building. Out steps Lieutenant General Matthew B. Ridgway, the man President Truman selected to replace MacArthur just days earlier. Ridgway wears no overcoat despite the biting wind. His helmet strap is tight beneath his chin. Grenades are clipped neatly to his harness, not for effect, but because he expects combat at any hour. He surveys the city with a slow, assessing gaze. The Chinese Spring offensive is imminent. The capital may fall again at any moment. Yet Ridgway's presence radiates something the exhausted American and South Korean troops have not felt for months. Confidence. Ridgway takes command, and everything starts to change. He calls his staff together inside a war-torn schoolhouse that now serves as 8th Army headquarters. The building's windows are shattered, its chalkboards cracked. A map of the peninsula hangs lopsided on a bullet-scarred wall. Ridgway steps to the front. "Gentlemen," he says, voice steady, "the 8th Army is no longer retreating." Officers exchange uncertain glances. "We hold," Ridgway continues, "and then we throw them back." He begins laying out his vision. Rebuilding morale, shortening defensive lines, strengthening artillery coordination, the aggressive patrolling to seize the initiative, restoring logistical control after months of chaotic withdrawal, reorganizing units shattered in the Chosin breakout. His tone is clipped, authoritative, unshakably clear. Where MacArthur had given grand visions, Ridgway gives battle plans. He moves from table to table, quizzing colonels on supply shortages, probing artillery officers on ammunition reserves, asking engineers about bridging capabilities along the Han River. No detail escapes him. "General," a staff major ventures cautiously, "our intelligence estimates say the Chinese may attack with as many as 350,000 men." Ridgway nods. "Then we'll break 350,000. His absolute conviction spreads through the room like electricity. The line holds. The Chinese Spring Offensive begins. April 22, 1951. Night. A distant rumble begins along the Imjin River. Thunder? Artillery. Then the hills erupt. Thousands of Chinese soldiers surge downhill in human waves, blasting bugles, firing burp guns, hurling grenades. Their movements flicker against the darkness like living shadows. UN outposts light up with tracer rounds. Mortars pound ridgelines. Radio operators shout over static. The Chinese Spring Offensive has begun. Along the Western Front, soldiers of the British Gloucestershire Regiment dig in near Hill 235. Their commander, Colonel James Kahn, moves along the trenches under fire, adjusting positions, shouting encouragement. "Steady, lads. Hold your ground." Farther east, South Korean forces buckle under the pressure and begin to fall back. But Ridgway has prepared for this. Reinforcements swing into position, plugging gaps, counterattacking where possible. Bullets slap into tree trunks. Shell bursts shake the earth. Wounded men cry for medics. Field telephones ring ceaselessly. Yet even as the enemy pushes forward, Ridgway's doctrine holds. Defend. Bleed the enemy. Then counterattack. Day after day, the Chinese hurl themselves at the UN lines. And day after day, those lines bend, but do not break. The turning point, Ridgway's counterblow. By the end of April, the Chinese offensive begins to falter. Their supply lines stretch thin across mountains and ravines. Ammunition runs low. Rations run out. Exhaustion sets in. Ridgway senses the moment. Prepare to advance, he orders. On May 20th, the 8th Army strikes. American tanks rumble forward across the plains. Artillery thunders in rolling barrages. South Korean infantry move in coordinated waves, recapturing lost positions. The UN front surges north. The effect is immediate and devastating. Chinese forces, caught off balance, begin withdrawing. Some units suffer catastrophic losses. Entire battalions crumble under the combined pressure of firepower and maneuver. Ridgway's counteroffensive becomes a masterclass in operational art, demonstrating what disciplined planning and unified command can accomplish. The world takes notice. So does Congress. While MacArthur testifies about the need to expand the war, Ridgway demonstrates that Korea can be stabilized, and possibly won, without escalating into China. Bradley's argument gains strength. MacArthur's claims weaken. But the hearings are not over. Not by a long shot. Behind closed doors, the Joint Chiefs solidify their position. May 1951. Pentagon War Room. It is late. Dim green lamps cast pools of light over large tables covered in maps. The Joint Chiefs gather around a central display, tracing unit movements with grease pencils. Intelligence officers shuffle briefings thick with intercepted communications. Bradley listens silently as Generals Ridgway and Collins describe the success of the counteroffensive. Chinese forces have withdrawn from their April objectives, Ridgway reports via secure line. Our casualties are manageable. Morale has improved across the 8th Army. An Air Force colonel hands Bradley a folder containing the latest reconnaissance photos of Manchurian supply hubs. Bradley scans the images. His suspicions deepen. Massive stockpiles of ammunition and fuel. New railway spurs. Soviet-made MiG-15s pre-positioned. Fresh troop concentrations just north of the Yalu. He closes the folder. If MacArthur's plan had gone forward, if the US had bombed these sites or invaded across the Yalu, Soviet intervention would not have been hypothetical. It would have been inevitable. Gentlemen, Bradley says quietly, the hearings will continue. We must remain unified. Each chief nods. The stakes are clear. They are not defending Truman's pride. They are defending the United States from strategic catastrophe. The hearings resume, and the strategy takes shape. May 23, 1951. Senate Chamber. Bradley returns for cross-examination. He sits calmly, his notes arranged neatly before him. Across from him, senators hold marked-up copies of MacArthur's testimony, some highlighted in red ink, some peppered with skeptical annotations. Senator Styles Bridges leans forward. General Bradley, General MacArthur insists that the war cannot be won unless we attack Chinese bases. Is that not correct? Bradley shakes his head. Senator, the war can be won, but not in the way General MacArthur proposes. Our goal is not to conquer China. It is to secure the Korean peninsula. Senator Kefauver interjects. An escalation would jeopardize Europe? Without question, Bradley replies. We cannot protect Europe and fight a full-scale war in Asia. A few pages rustle. Someone coughs. A pencil rolls slowly across the desk. The senators are beginning to see the full picture. MacArthur's war is expansive. Bradley's war is realistic. Ridgway's war is working. The NATO factor, the hidden pressure point. During a break, Senator Tidings motions Bradley into a private side room. The walls are lined with framed maps. A single lamp casts a warm glow. General, Tidings says quietly, I need the truth. How bad is the NATO situation? Bradley exhales slowly. Senator, if we pull divisions from Europe, we risk inviting a Soviet attack. They outnumber us almost 4-1 across the Central Front. And if we escalate in Korea? Then we will lose Western Europe. And if that happens, the balance of global power shifts forever. Tidings nods slowly. He now understands the magnitude of Bradley's earlier phrase, the wrong enemy. Not because China is harmless, but because the Soviet Union is far more dangerous. Right war, right place, the birth of the Korean armistice strategy. The hearings conclude with a final, critical question. Senator Johnson asks, General Bradley, if we do not pursue General MacArthur's plan, what should we do? Bradley folds his hands. We should fight a limited war. Hold the line. Bleed the enemy until they cannot continue. Then negotiate. It sounds simple. But this is the foundation of the strategy that will eventually lead to the Korean armistice. Ridgway executes it on the battlefield. Truman defends it in the Oval Office. Bradley articulates it before Congress. A strategy born from Chosin's frozen mountains, tempered by intelligence, and defended through constitutional authority. And now, as spring fades into summer, the nation begins to shift. MacArthur's star remains bright, but its orbit has changed. Bradley's steady voice resonates deeply with the American public. Ridgway delivers tangible results in Korea. Truman regains political footing. But the crisis is not yet resolved. One final confrontation remains, one that will determine the future of American civil-military relations forever. Room 318 of the Senate Office Building was already packed when General Omar Bradley stepped inside, the heavy oak doors closing behind him with a soft, decisive thud. The overhead lights hummed, hot and unforgiving. Photographers crowded the walls. Senators straightened in their chairs. Stenographers readied their keys. The air crackled with the anticipation of a nation waiting to see which of its legendary generals would shape the direction of a war half a world away. Bradley walked slowly toward the witness table, deliberate, composed, the weight of decades of command hanging from his shoulders like the rows of ribbons across his uniform. His five-star insignia glittered beneath the lights, but they brought him no comfort. Behind him, the door to the hallway swung open to let in a gust of cold air and a brief murmur from the crowd outside. Thousands waited on radio and in newspaper offices for every word he was about to speak. America was holding its breath. He set a folder of classified documents gently on the tabletop. Thin. Deceptively thin. Inside were the Joint Chiefs' assessments of MacArthur's proposals, documents too sensitive to be read aloud, but powerful enough that their conclusions hovered like a shadow over every question the senators would ask. Senator Richard Russell, the committee chair, cleared his throat. General Bradley, he said, voice low, thank you for coming. Please proceed, in your own words. Bradley nodded once. He placed both hands flat on the table, leaned toward the microphone, and let the room fall silent. When General MacArthur proposes an expansion of the Korean conflict into mainland China, Bradley began, his voice firm but even, he proposes a war against the wrong enemy, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Gasps rippled through the public gallery. A senator whispered to his colleague, he said it. He actually said it. Bradley didn't pause. Our primary enemy is global communism, yes, he continued. But the center of gravity of that threat lies in Europe, not Asia. If we were to commit major forces to China, we would weaken our position in Germany, leave our NATO allies vulnerable, and risk triggering a global war for which the world is not prepared. As he spoke, one could almost see the maps, the Fulda Gap, the divided city of Berlin, the Soviet armored divisions massed just beyond Western Europe's fragile defensive lines. Bradley's voice carried the weight of that broader battlefield, a war far larger than the Korean Peninsula, a war whose ignition point could be a single miscalculation. Senator Margaret Chase Smith leaned forward. General, are you suggesting General MacArthur's assessment of the Chinese military threat was inaccurate? Bradley lowered his eyes briefly to the table before answering. I'm suggesting, he said carefully, that the intelligence available to us shows China has far more troops available for Korean operations than General MacArthur has acknowledged. They have not yet committed their full strength. If we attack their mainland, they absolutely will. He reached into the folder, withdrew a single sheet of paper, and slid it toward the senators. Only the committee could view it, classified, marked NOFON in bold red letters. Bradley summarized what they were reading. The Chinese have 30 divisions in Korea. They have 50 more across the Yalu. And they can mobilize millions of militia. If we provoke them on their own soil, we face a war without limit. The stenographer's type bars hammered so rapidly one jammed. A clerk rushed to replace it. Senator Wayne Morse adjusted his spectacles. General, he said slowly, you're saying MacArthur's plan risks something beyond the scope of the Korean conflict? Bradley looked directly at him, the room shrinking to a pinpoint of tension. I'm saying, Senator, it risks World War III. A silence followed, long enough for everyone to feel the gravity of those words, heavy enough to tilt the room. Outside the building, the late spring wind rustled the American flags lining Constitution Avenue. Civilians on the steps paused to listen to the radio broadcasts pouring from open windows and press vans. The entire country could feel it, history shifting beneath their feet. Inside, Senator Russell leaned back in his chair. General, he said, can you explain why maintaining our position in Korea, rather than expanding the war, is strategically necessary? Bradley inhaled deeply. Korea is a limited war, he said. We cannot allow a limited war to become an unlimited one. If we keep it contained, if we avoid widening it, we protect Europe, maintain the NATO alliance, and prevent the Soviet Union from entering the conflict. He tapped the tabletop lightly, a subtle gesture marking each point. And above all, he continued, we uphold the principle that military commanders do not dictate national policy. Civilian authority, through the President and Congress, must remain supreme. That is the cornerstone of our republic. A few senators exchanged glances. Some approving. Some troubled. A few visibly angry. But Bradley pressed on. General MacArthur is a brilliant commander, he acknowledged. But no commander, however gifted, can be permitted to pursue war aims contrary to the policy of the United States. That is the heart of this matter. Senator Styles Bridges leaned forward, his voice sharp. General Bradley, are you suggesting that General MacArthur has defied the President? Bradley did not blink. I'm stating that he has publicly advocated policies that contradict those established by the Commander-in-Chief. Policies which, if acted upon, would place the United States at extreme risk. The room erupted, journalists scribbling furiously, senators speaking at once, spectators murmuring loudly. The chairman had to strike his gavel 3 times to restore order. When quiet returned, Bradley continued, his tone steady as granite. War, he said, must be guided by clear policy. Strategy must serve national interest. No general, myself included, has the right to choose a war of his own. He paused, letting the words settle. That is why we are here today. For the next 6 hours, Bradley fielded questions on troop dispositions, supply lines, Soviet capabilities, and nuclear policy. He cited intelligence assessments still unknown to the public, estimates of Soviet stockpiles, Chinese reserve divisions, and political vulnerabilities within the early NATO structure. He described the importance of holding Busan as a logistical anchor, the risks of deep operations beyond the Yalu, and the impossibility of securing a decisive victory in China without millions of American troops. Every word he spoke pulled the committee further from MacArthur's vision of total war, and closer to Truman's strategy of limited conflict. By the time he finished his testimony, dusk was glowing against the windows. The lights of Washington flickered on one by one, street lamps, car headlights, office windows in the Capitol dome silhouetted against the evening sky. Bradley gathered his papers quietly. He thanked the senators. He walked out of the room with the same slow, measured steps he had taken coming in. But the nation was different now. The debate had changed. And MacArthur's vision of a wider war was slipping away like smoke. Bradley stepped into the hallway, flashbulbs exploding around him. For a moment he squinted against the bright light, then he continued forward, silent, his duty done. The 7-week hearings had only just begun. But the turning point had come today. The Pentagon. 8 levels deep, beneath fluorescent lights and reinforced concrete, a secure briefing room buzzed with the quiet, mechanical churn of air filtration systems. The walls were thick enough to stop a bomb, but today they served a quieter purpose, shielding the most sensitive intelligence in the United States from the ears of the world. General Omar Bradley stood at the head of a long table, the green felt surface covered with maps, reconnaissance photos, decrypted cables, and casualty estimates stamped with red ink, top secret, restricted handling. Across from him sat a rotating group of senators from the Joint Committee, escorted 2 at a time by military police. They had heard Bradley's public testimony on Capitol Hill. Today they would hear what MacArthur had not been allowed to see, and what President Truman had used to form his most consequential decisions of the Cold War. The first slide clicked into place on the projector. Aerial photography of Manchuria, taken by RB-45 Tornado jet reconnaissance flights operating near the Yalu River. Grainy. High contrast. But unmistakable. Rows upon rows of Chinese troop encampments. Colonel James Dougherty, the intelligence briefer, stepped forward and pointed with a thin black baton. "These are Chinese 3rd Field Army units," he explained. "They haven't crossed into Korea. They're at full strength. And we believe they are waiting." Senator Harry Kane furrowed his brow. "Waiting for what?" Bradley answered quietly, "For us to make the first move." He clicked to the next slide. This one showed rail lines stretching across northern China, packed with freight cars. Colonel Dougherty spoke again. "We've intercepted Soviet traffic indicating that Moscow has agreed to support China with logistics and air operations if the United States crosses the Yalu or bombs Manchurian airfields." Senator William Noland leaned forward, knuckles white. "Soviet pilots? Actual combat units?" "Already happening," Bradley said. "Right now? In MiG Alley. We estimate that up to half the MiGs our Air Force engages are flown by Soviet pilots. They just don't transmit in Russian." A stunned silence filled the room. Bradley continued, his voice low and steady. "If we bomb China, the Soviets will not stay hidden. They will intervene openly. And then Korea becomes the opening front of a global war." He let the senators absorb that. Most didn't speak. A few exhaled sharply, men realizing that a decision they had once viewed as strategic now bordered on apocalyptic. Bradley turned the page in the folder before him. "Now," he said, "let's talk nuclear." The lights dimmed automatically for the next slide. On the screen appeared a map of the Chinese mainland, with red circles marking industrial centers: Shenyang, Harbin, Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai. Senator Russell shifted uneasily. "You're saying General MacArthur requested atomic weapons?" Bradley nodded. "Yes. 34 of them." A few senators inhaled sharply. Others stared at the glowing map, frozen. "He requested delivery systems we don't have in theater," Bradley continued. He suggested broadcasting threats of radioactive fallout to Chinese troop concentrations. And he proposed creating, quote, "a belt of radioactive cobalt across the Korean border, a zone that would remain lethal for decades." Bradley allowed the weight of those words to settle. "Such a plan," he said, "would force the Soviets to respond. They have nuclear capability. They have delivery systems. And they have alliances they cannot afford to abandon." The senators exchanged looks, eyes wide, jaws tight, the magnitude of the situation dawning on them like a slow-moving tidal wave. Then Bradley set aside the projector remote and addressed them directly. "What General MacArthur proposes," he said, "is not the defeat of China. It is the ignition of a global nuclear war. A war fought across Europe, Asia, and possibly the continental United States." He paused. "And one we cannot win without losing millions of American lives." No one spoke for several seconds. When Senator Kane finally broke the silence, his voice was barely above a whisper. "General, if these briefings had been public, MacArthur's plan would have collapsed overnight." Bradley shook his head. "If these briefings had been public," he said softly, "the Soviets would know we know their movements. We would compromise sources that took years, and sometimes lives, to obtain." He gestured toward the pile of documents. "This intelligence is the spine of our national security. And protecting it is why the President, not the generals, directs war policy." Another senator asked the question that many had been avoiding. "General, was MacArthur unaware of this intelligence? Or did he disregard it?" Bradley spoke carefully. "Much of this intelligence was compartmentalized. General MacArthur did not have authority to see all of it. Some was withheld because he disagreed with analysts and challenged their conclusions publicly. Some because he did not trust the CIA. And some," Bradley inhaled quietly, "because he had already committed mentally to expanding the war." He closed the folder. "What I can say with certainty is this: his plan was built on assumptions that do not match the intelligence available to us." One of the senators leaned back, rubbing his temples. "If this gets out, the country will tear itself apart over who knew what, and when." Bradley nodded slowly. "That," he said, is precisely why we must keep these briefings classified. And why we must anchor our decisions not in ambition, pride, or past victories, but in the realities of the world as it exists today. He looked around the room, meeting each senator's eyes, one by one. "Gentlemen," he said, "a war with China is not just a war with China. It is a war with the Soviet Union. A war with the Red Army in Europe. A war that will consume the free world." He stepped back from the table. "Our duty is to prevent that war, not to start it." The room fell silent. The senators stared at the maps, recognizing the fragile balance of the early Cold War for what it truly was, a powder keg waiting for the smallest spark. And for the first time since MacArthur's dismissal, some of them understood the full gravity behind Bradley's phrase. The wrong war, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong enemy. They dismissed the briefing and filed out slowly, each man walking as though carrying an invisible weight. Behind them, Bradley gathered the classified documents. He slipped them into a secure envelope. He locked them in a metal cabinet that would not be opened to the public for another 20 years. Outside, the Pentagon corridors echoed with footsteps and hushed conversations, but deep underground, the war America almost entered remained sealed in silence. Far above, the Korean peninsula still burned. But for now, just for now, the world had been pulled back from the edge. Wake Island lay far behind them now, a memory carved into the political landscape as deeply as the Pacific winds carved its coral shores. That meeting months earlier, MacArthur's confident assurances, Truman's uneasy nods, sat like a ghost in the president's mind. But tonight, aboard the presidential aircraft, Independence, the real fight for America's future was no longer across an ocean. It was in Washington. And it was about to explode. The plane hummed with the low, constant vibration of its engines, slicing through cold April air. Truman sat beneath a reading lamp, a stack of classified reports spread out like a mosaic of crisis across the small table in front of him. His thick glasses caught the warm yellow glow as he flipped through another transcript, MacArthur's latest cable, sent not to him, but to Congressman Joseph Martin. A cable that openly contradicted U.S. policy. A cable that challenged the very idea of civilian control. A cable promising victory through escalation. Truman exhaled, a slow, steady release of the pressure that had been building for months. Across from him, Secretary of State Dean Acheson leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped tightly. "He's daring you," Acheson said softly. "Daring you to fire him." Truman didn't answer immediately. He tapped the cable with his index finger. "He's trying to steer policy from Tokyo," the president murmured. "That's not his job. That's mine." Acheson nodded but said nothing more. The engines droned. A steward moved quietly down the narrow aisle, offering Truman coffee. Truman waved him off. Another advisor cleared his throat. "Sir," he said carefully, "if you relieve MacArthur, there will be political consequences." Truman's head snapped up. "There will be worse consequences," he said sharply, "if a general is allowed to decide when this nation goes to war with China, or with Russia." His voice softened but did not weaken. "We are not going to risk World War III because one man believes he is above the Constitution." The advisors fell silent. Everyone in the cabin sensed it, the turning point, the fulcrum on which the entire Cold War might balance. Outside the window, clouds churned in a moonless sky. Truman closed the folder. "It ends," he said. "Tomorrow. Tokyo, the news breaks." The next day, at MacArthur's Tokyo headquarters, footsteps echoed briskly down polished hallways. A young army major carried an envelope stamped with presidential seal and the words "Deliver immediately." He paused outside MacArthur's office. Straightened his uniform. Knocked once. Inside, General Douglas MacArthur sat at his desk, the morning sun filtering through bamboo shades. His corncob pipe rested near an open map of Korea, red lines marking his proposed advance into Manchuria. He did not look up. "Yes? Message from Washington, sir." MacArthur broke the seal, expecting another routine communication. Instead, he found the one order he believed no president would dare send him. "You are hereby relieved." He read the sentence twice. The room was so quiet that the ticking of his desk clock felt like hammer blows. His chief of staff, Major General Courtney Whitney, looked at him with growing alarm. "Sir?" MacArthur folded the letter with slow, deliberate precision. "They've done it," he said quietly. Whitney blinked. "Done what, sir?" MacArthur looked up, eyes cold. "They fired me." For a full 10 seconds, no one moved. Then Whitney, stunned, whispered, "Mr. President Truman actually dismissed you." MacArthur set the letter aside, rising from his chair with an eerie calm. "Not Truman," he said. "Bradley." Whitney frowned. "Sir?" MacArthur walked toward the window, staring out at the city he had ruled like a viceroy for 6 years. "Bradley convinced him," MacArthur muttered. "That mild-mannered schoolboy soldier. He did this." From the hallway came the distant murmur of officers learning the news, disbelief rippling through the ranks. MacArthur drew himself tall, jaw set like stone. "Prepare my departure speech." Washington, the firestorm. Radio bulletins cut into programming across the United States. General Douglas MacArthur has been relieved of command. Within hours, spontaneous protests erupted in several cities. Legislators flooded the White House with condemnations. Editorial pages ignited with fury. Some accused Truman of cowardice. Others accused MacArthur of insubordination. But in the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs stood firm behind the president. They issued a unified statement confirming. MacArthur had violated policy. He had undermined civilian authority. His strategy would have risked a catastrophic war. Reporters swarmed the Defense Department entrance like hornets, shouting questions. Fleet Admiral William Lee brushed past them, jaw tight. "Omar Bradley speaks for all of us," he said. "And he speaks the truth." MacArthur's return, the speech that shook America. April 19, 1951. The U.S. Capitol. MacArthur arrived to give his farewell address to Congress. Flashbulbs blazed as he entered the House chamber. The galleries overflowed, soldiers, diplomats, foreign attachés, housewives from Maryland, veterans from the Pacific who had taken overnight trains to see him speak. He walked slowly, savoring the moment. The applause crashed like thunder. Some senators stood on their chairs to see him better. MacArthur approached the podium, a tall, austere figure silhouetted against the marble columns. "Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, distinguished members of Congress." His voice rolled through the chamber, rich and resonant. He spoke of honor, destiny, and the tragedy of being forced to fade away. He called Korea an untimely war. He warned of appeasement. He defended his plan to expand the conflict. The audience erupted again and again, applause rising like a wave. But in a secure Pentagon briefing room, Bradley watched the broadcast without emotion. He had already seen the casualties of escalation. He had seen the intelligence MacArthur ignored. He had read every classified estimate that said, "If we bomb China, nuclear war becomes probable." MacArthur's speech ended with the famous line, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." Bradley switched off the television. "Fading away," he murmured, "is better than blowing the world to pieces." In the Senate, the confrontation looms. Days later, senators filed into the hearing chamber for the showdown. 7 weeks of testimony that would expose the fault lines in American strategy, civil-military relations, and Cold War doctrine. MacArthur would testify. Bradley would testify. The Joint Chiefs would testify. But the senators wanted one thing above all: to know who was right. MacArthur's expansionist strategy? Or Truman and Bradley's doctrine of limited war? Whispers filled the chamber as the witnesses took their seats. Cameras clicked. The room fell silent. And the duel between two titans, one commanding armies, the other commanding the Constitution, was about to begin. Room 318, Senate Office Building. The chamber was already packed when General Omar Bradley stepped through the doorway. Rows of photographers surged forward, their flashbulbs flickering like lightning trapped in a bottle. Senators whispered to one another, shuffling papers filled with questions sharpened like knives. Bradley paused just inside the threshold. He wasn't the kind of man who commanded a room by swagger or theatrics. But the moment he entered, the atmosphere shifted, like a pressure drop before a storm. He adjusted his uniform coat, its ribbons neat, understated. No pipe, no sunglasses, no theatrical flourish. Just the quiet presence of a man who had led millions of soldiers through the European killing fields and never once asked for applause. A Marine door guard saluted. Bradley returned it, then walked toward the witness table. A nation watching. Above him, the galleries were packed shoulder to shoulder with spectators, housewives from Ohio, veterans in faded dress uniforms, college students scribbling notes, foreign attachés listening through headsets. Journalists filled the aisles, elbows perched on notepads. America was obsessed. This wasn't just testimony. This was a constitutional earthquake. At the center of the table, facing a forest of microphones, sat the Joint Chiefs. Bradley took the middle seat, chairman of the JCS, the man who would speak for all of them. To his left sat General J. Lawton Collins, Army Chief of Staff. To his right, Admiral Forrest Sherman, Chief of Naval Operations. Further down, General Hoyt Vandenberg of the Air Force and Marine Commandant Clifton Cates. A senator leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "That is more military authority in one row than any room in America has held since the war." The chairman's gavel cracked sharply. "The committee will come to order." The chatter died instantly. Bradley folded his hands before him, calm, steady, unreadable. The opening salvo. "General Bradley," Senator Richard Russell began, leaning so close his voice clipped the microphone, "please explain, in your own words, the Joint Chiefs' position regarding General MacArthur's proposal to expand the war into China." Dozens of pens hit notepads. Typewriters clacked in the hallway. Bradley inhaled slowly. "Senator," he began, "our position is based on strategic reality, not emotion, not pride, not personal rivalry." His voice was flat, the tone of a man used to briefing presidents with bad news. He continued, "To expand this war would risk committing the United States to full-scale conflict with the People's Republic of China and potentially the Soviet Union. In our judgment, this would be—" He paused. "The wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy." Silence swept the room. It was the first time he had said the phrase publicly. Every senator present knew it would become the quote of the century. Flashbulbs erupted. Pens raced across paper. Newspapers would run it in bold headlines the next morning. Bradley added, "Our national interest lies not in conquering Asia, but in preserving Europe from Soviet domination. NATO is our primary strategic commitment." Senator William Knowland, a fierce MacArthur supporter, narrowed his eyes. "So you believe General MacArthur was wrong?" Bradley did not flinch. "I believe General MacArthur proposed a course of action that, if adopted, would almost certainly lead to a Third World War." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Knowland pressed harder. "But General, are you telling this committee that the United States cannot defeat China?" Bradley turned his head toward him, expression unchanged. "Senator, we could defeat China. That is not the question. The question is how many American lives it would cost, and what the Soviet Union would do while our forces were tied down in Asia." The words hit like artillery shells. Knowland leaned forward, voice rising. "General, answer plainly. Could we or could we not conquer China?" Bradley's reply was ice. "Senator, to conquer China would require the commitment of millions of American soldiers and the devastation of entire regions. We would become ensnared in a land war of unending duration. And while we did, Stalin would be free to overrun Europe." Bradley paused. "That, Senator, would be strategic suicide." Gasps swept the gallery. Inside the intelligence files, Senator Paul Douglas adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "General Bradley," he asked, "the committee has heard suggestions that classified intelligence influenced your view. Can you elaborate?" Bradley exchanged a glance with Admiral Sherman, who gave a subtle nod. "Senator, the Joint Chiefs reviewed intelligence reports from Korea, Japan, and Europe. Among them were communications intercepts indicating that the Soviet Union had pledged material support to China should we escalate." Some senators stiffened. Bradley continued. "We also had reports, since declassified, showing Soviet reinforcement movements west of Manchuria and indications that the USSR was prepared to intervene directly if provoked." He let the implications hang in the air. If we expanded the war, Russia would not sit on its hands. Several senators scribbled furiously, trying to capture every syllable. Across the gallery, a reporter mouthed to a colleague, "This changes everything." The Chosin reality. Senator Wayne Morse leaned closer, voice low. "General, would you describe how the events at the Chosin Reservoir shaped your conclusion that expansion was too dangerous?" Bradley's expression darkened. "Chosin," he began, "demonstrated very clearly that China is neither weak nor disorganized. Their leadership deployed multiple field armies into Korea without our detecting the movement in time. They demonstrated coordination, discipline, and the capacity for surprise." He clasped his hands. General MacArthur underestimated them. Gravely, he looked straight at the senators. "At Chosin, we nearly lost an entire Marine division. Only their heroic fighting withdrawal prevented catastrophe. In any future conflict on Chinese soil, we would face that, multiplied 100-fold. The room was now so quiet that Bradley's voice carried like a drumbeat. "We cannot underestimate China," he said. "And we cannot underestimate the Soviet Union behind them." The turning point. Senator Margaret Chase Smith leaned back, studying Bradley. "General, is it your position that the President was correct to relieve General MacArthur?" The question every camera crew wanted. Bradley replied without hesitation. "Yes, Senator. The President was correct." A murmur rolled through the crowd. He continued. "General MacArthur directly challenged civilian authority. That is not merely inappropriate. It is dangerous. The Constitution is clear: military authority must remain subordinate to civilian leadership." The senators stared at him, some in admiration, others in astonishment, others in silent fury. Bradley's voice did not waver. "Had we allowed this precedent, future generals could determine national policy based on their personal beliefs. That is not democracy. That is military government." Flashbulbs erupted again. The moment the nation turned. Senator Russell whispered something to his aide. Senator Morse leaned back in thought. Even the stanchest MacArthur supporters seemed shaken. Bradley had done what few thought possible. He had shifted the national mood. Not through theatrics. Not through emotion. But through quiet, relentless clarity. This was no feud between two generals. This was the most important civil-military confrontation of the 20th century. And Bradley had just drawn the line in granite. The hearings had miles to go. MacArthur would return to the stand, senators would clash, newspapers would erupt, but something irreversible had happened. America had heard the truth. And the truth carried the weight of a man who had led 1 million sons through Europe and refused to gamble 1 million more. Bradley adjusted his papers as the senators prepared their next barrage of questions. The real battle, over the future of American foreign policy, was now fully underway. The hearings had entered their second week, but the atmosphere inside the chamber had already become electric. Journalists described it as a war of words, and the most important battle since 1945, though the conflict they were analyzing was hundreds of miles away in frozen mountains of Korea. Outside, spring sunlight filtered through the Capitol's stone columns, a cruel contrast to the frozen hell of Chosin and the political storm inside. General Omar Bradley sat at the center of the witness table, his notes neatly arranged, his demeanor calm yet unyielding. Every senator in the room knew that what he would say today could define American strategy for the entire Cold War era. Limited war, a calculated alternative. Senator Wayne Morse leaned forward, tapping a pencil against the table. "General Bradley," he said, "you've spoken at length about the dangers of expanding the Korean War. But tell this committee, what, in your judgment, constitutes an acceptable strategy for the United States?" Bradley looked around the chamber, meeting each senator's gaze. "Senator," he began, "we must understand what we are fighting for, and what we are not. Korea is a limited conflict. Our objective is to secure the peninsula, protect South Korea, and maintain the credibility of the United Nations without provoking a global conflagration." He tapped the tabletop lightly for emphasis. "To achieve this, we rely on precise application of force, coordination among allied nations, and clear political objectives. We must resist the temptation to escalate beyond our means or beyond our purpose." The words hung in the air. A reporter in the gallery scribbled rapidly, recognizing the birth of a doctrine that would define U.S. military policy for decades. The Chosin lesson applied. Bradley paused, then continued, his voice steady. The events at the Chosin Reservoir underscore the importance of discipline, preparation, and respect for the enemy. Our forces were almost overwhelmed, not by the enemy's strength alone, but by underestimating the conditions and overextending ourselves. He spread a map before the committee, showing the position of UN forces in North Korea. By learning from Chosin, we restructure operations to conserve lives, maintain momentum, and apply force strategically. We do not seek conquest, we seek containment. Senator Paul Douglas, pen poised, asked the obvious question. And containment, General, does that require attacking China? Bradley shook his head. No, Senator. Attacking China would risk the annihilation of our forces, the involvement of the Soviet Union, and potentially the outbreak of a nuclear war. We must hold the line, apply selective pressure, and negotiate from strength. Civilian control and constitutional principles. Bradley leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table. His tone sharpened slightly, the words carrying the weight of history. This committee must understand. A general may advise, but a general does not dictate national policy. Our nation's security depends not only on the effectiveness of our forces but on the supremacy of civilian authority. A ripple of approval ran through parts of the chamber. Some senators nodded, others scowled, clearly aware of the confrontation looming with MacArthur's supporters outside the hearing room. If we permit one man to override the Constitution and national policy, Bradley continued, we place the Republic itself at risk. This is not abstract theory. It is the principle by which our democracy survives. NATO, Europe, and global implications. Bradley turned to a larger map, displaying Western Europe and Soviet troop concentrations. Our primary strategic concern is not Asia alone. NATO must remain strong. The Soviet Union is prepared to exploit any distraction, any overextension in Korea, to achieve dominance in Europe. Our allies depend on our restraint and strategic clarity. He looked at the senators, voice firm. Had we expanded the war, we would have been unable to meet our obligations to defend Europe, and the entire balance of the Cold War would have shifted in favor of the Soviets. The gravity of his words settled on the committee like a cold weight. Every senator now grasped the interconnectedness of Korea, Europe, and the nuclear age in a way that no public debate could convey. Bradley vs. MacArthur, Strategic Philosophy. Senator Styles Bridges finally asked what everyone wanted to know. General Bradley, how do your views differ from those of General MacArthur? Bradley's eyes remained steady. MacArthur seeks decisive victory through massive escalation. He believes the United States must expand the war to achieve a complete and permanent defeat of China. I argue that such escalation is unnecessary, dangerous, and potentially catastrophic. Victory is measured not by territorial conquest, but by achieving strategic objectives with the minimum risk to our nation. He paused for effect. History will judge whether ambition or prudence serves the nation best. My testimony seeks to ensure that judgment is informed, not reckless. The impact on the Senate and the nation. By the end of the session, the mood in the chamber had shifted. Bradley's calm, authoritative, and meticulously reasoned testimony had done what few expected. He had reframed the debate from emotion and prestige to strategy and constitutional principle. He had made the public and Congress understand the real consequences of escalation. He had created a foundation for a new doctrine, limited war in the nuclear age. Reporters flooded the press galleries, eager to file their copy. Headlines the next day would read variations of Bradley warns, wrong war, wrong place, wrong time, wrong enemy, Joint Chiefs advocate containment over conquest, Truman's decision vindicated by military leadership. Bradley, however, remained impassive. He knew the battle was not yet fully won. MacArthur's allies would continue to push, the public would still debate, and the Cold War required vigilance. But for the first time, the principles of limited war, civilian control, and strategic restraint were firmly articulated in the nation's capital. The hearings would continue for 7 intense weeks. But Bradley's testimony had already shaped the narrative, defined the doctrine, and preserved the fragile balance between military ambition and civilian oversight. He collected his notes, stood, and walked from the chamber as quietly as he had entered. Outside, the spring sun warmed the Capitol steps. Inside, a nation watched. And in the minds of policymakers, a clear principle had emerged. Never again would America gamble with the world on the pride of a single general. The 7-week Senate hearings had ended. The chamber, once a theater of tension and debate, now stood empty, echoing faintly with the memory of every question asked, every word weighed, every strategic truth revealed. Across the nation, Americans had followed the testimony through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and emerging television coverage. The dialogue about war, power, and the role of the military had reached the living rooms of ordinary citizens, shaping public perception of both the Korean conflict and American governance. General Omar Bradley emerged from the Senate building into the summer sun. His uniform, meticulously pressed and adorned with the stars and ribbons earned over decades of service, shimmered softly in the morning light. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe, knowing that his careful, measured words had changed the course of national policy. Truman's vindication. President Harry S. Truman, observing the hearings from the Oval Office, felt a quiet sense of vindication. Bradley's testimony had achieved what political speeches could not. It had framed MacArthur's removal not as a political act, but as a necessary strategic decision. It underscored that no individual, regardless of rank or past glory, could supersede civilian authority or the broader strategic calculus. Truman wrote in his diary, "Bradley spoke with the weight of experience and the authority of truth. The nation may yet understand why the decision was necessary. Without him, I fear MacArthur's ambitions might have carried us into disaster." The Korean War, lessons applied. In Korea, Bradley's foresight and the principles he articulated began to guide the UN and US military response. The focus shifted decisively to containment, not conquest. The Pusan perimeter was stabilized, supply lines secured, and strategic withdrawals executed with precision. The Chosin Reservoir disaster was studied extensively as a case of underestimating the enemy and the environment. Future operations prioritized intelligence accuracy, logistical foresight, and realistic assessment of enemy capabilities. Generals in the field began to recognize the principle Bradley had articulated: victories in war must be weighed against their strategic consequences, particularly when the possibility of nuclear escalation loomed. Strategic doctrine: limited war in the nuclear age. Bradley's testimony laid the groundwork for the doctrine of limited war that would dominate U.S. military strategy throughout the Cold War. It emphasized 1. Containment over conquest. Strategic goals should match achievable objectives. 2. Prudence over ambition. The lives of soldiers and civilians must be preserved. 3. Civilian oversight. Military actions must remain subordinate to elected leaders. 4. Global perspective. Conflicts must be considered within the context of worldwide alliances and potential adversaries, including nuclear powers. By formalizing these principles, Bradley ensured that future American military planners would approach limited conflicts with the full weight of strategic realism and ethical consideration. MacArthur's departure and public response. Douglas MacArthur returned to the United States to a hero's welcome, a stark contrast to the silent deliberation inside the Senate chambers. Parades, speeches, and media coverage portrayed him as a martyr general, a symbol of military glory and independence. Yet, while public sentiment celebrated his personal legacy, Bradley's testimony had ensured that MacArthur's strategic vision would not dictate U.S. policy. The country had embraced the principle that no individual could compel national action contrary to democratic oversight. Bradley's enduring influence. General Omar Bradley retired from active service but remained a towering figure in military and political circles. His actions in 1951 became a benchmark for leadership under pressure, guiding both future military officers and civilian policymakers. He taught the nation that courage was not measured solely by battlefield heroics, but also by the moral and strategic clarity to stand for what is right, even against immense popular and institutional pressure. His phrase, The wrong war, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong enemy, entered the lexicon of military strategy, often cited in debates over foreign interventions, conflicts in Vietnam, Iraq, and beyond. It symbolized restraint, careful judgment, and respect for the delicate balance of global power. Legacy on civil-military relations. Bradley's Senate testimony reinforced the cornerstone of American democracy: civilian control of the military. Future conflicts, from Vietnam to the Gulf Wars, repeatedly referenced his principle that military leaders advise and execute, but do not dictate policy. His testimony became required reading in military academies, shaping generations of officers who learned the importance of both tactical skill and adherence to national law and policy. Conclusion: a nation steered from catastrophe. By combining intelligence, strategic foresight, and unwavering respect for constitutional principles, General Omar Bradley preserved not only the lives of thousands of soldiers in Korea but also the security of the nation and the integrity of its democratic institutions. His actions ensured that the Korean War remained a limited conflict, preventing escalation into global confrontation with China and the Soviet Union, and establishing the ethical and strategic standards for U.S. engagement in the nuclear era. For Bradley, the measure of success was simple: the preservation of America, its principles, and its people. In the eyes of history, he had won a victory greater than any battlefield triumph, a victory over hubris, over miscalculation, and over the dangerous allure of unrestrained military power.